My name is Stephen Botterill, and I'm the Associate Dean of the Undergraduate Division here on campus, and it's my pleasant duty to introduce today's speaker to you. But before I do that, I just want to say on behalf of the Undergraduate Division what an enormous pleasure it is for us to support this initiative. And I also want to pay public tribute to the hard work of Steve Tollefson and the other people in the college writing program that makes these wonderful encounters possible. As you know, today's speaker is Robert Hass. He will be interviewed by Kaya Oakes, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce Kaya to you. She's a lecturer in the college writing programs and an author. She's a recipient of an award from the Academy of American Poets, and her poems and essays have appeared in numerous journals. She's also the literature and creative writing editor for Kitchen Sink magazine and a teacher and consultant for the Bay Area Writing Project. Robert Hass belongs to that select company of individuals who genuinely need no introduction, but he'll be getting one anyway. He's a graduate of St. Mary's College and of Stanford. He was appointed Poet Laureate of the United States in 1995, and as I'm sure all of you know, he served with unusual grace and effectiveness in that role. His various books of poetry, Field Guide from 1973, Praise from 1979, Human Wishes, 1989, and Sun Under Wood, 1996, have all garnered considerable praise from critics, readers, and above all, lovers of poetry. He's been instrumental through his collaborations with another great Berkeley poet, Czesław Miłosz, in making the work of that Nobel Prize winner accessible to those of us who cannot read it in the original language, and also bringing his own extraordinary contribution to a fusing of two great poetic voices. On a campus which has a long-standing and highly prized tradition of poetry and encouraging the work of poets, Robert Hass is a stellar figure in that long line, and it's an enormous pleasure for me to introduce him to you now.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank the writing program for sponsoring this event. I guess the format is that I'm to read for about 10 minutes, and then Kaya and I will have a conversation about writing, which I guess is the function of this occasion, and then at some point we'll open it up to questions. So I guess I'm to write at the start to show you that I can do it, which is, and maybe I'll begin with it by reading. I'm just going to read things that are relatively new, some of them that I'm still fiddling with. I mean, in fact, everything I'm still fiddling with, just because it seems like the spirit of the occasion. This is a piece called Envy of Other People's Poems. In one version of the legend, the sirens couldn't sing. It was only a sailor's story that they could. So Odysseus, lashed to the mast, was harrowed by a music that he didn't hear. Plungings of sea, wind shear, the offshore hunger of the birds, and the mute women gathering kelp for garden mulch, seeing him strain against the cordage, seeing the awful longing in his eyes, are changed forever on their rocky waste of islands by their imagination of his imagination of the song they didn't sing. This piece is called Time and Materials, and this was written by invitation on the work of the German painter Gerhard Richter, whose retrospective, many people think that he's the most powerful European painter of the last 30 or 40 years, and there's a big retrospective show of his work at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco right now. A publisher was doing a book of his abstract work, which is only a small part of what he does, and asked a group of poets to write responses to these paintings. I had the prejudice that really nothing had happened of interest in abstraction in painting since the first generation of abstract expressionist painters, and it was amazing to me that what he had done, and I was given a chance to live with these, go visit these paintings before they were in a private collection at that point for weeks, and then try to do something. So this is Gerhard Richter, Abstract Bilden, Time and Materials. To make layers, as if they were a steadiness of days. It snowed, did errands at a desk, a white flurry out the window, thickening. My tongue tasted of the glue on envelopes. On this day, sunlight on red brick, bare trees, nothing stirring in the icy air. On this day, a blur of color moving where the heat from bodies meets the watery, cold surface of the glass. Made love, made curry, talked on the phone to friends. The one whose brother died was crying and thinking alternately, like someone falling down and getting up and running and falling and getting up. The object of this poem is not to not annihilate. The object of this poem is to report a theft in progress of everything that is not these words and their disposition on the page. The object of this poem is to report a theft in progress of everything that exists that is not the words and their position on the page. The object of poem, port, theft, progress, thing, cysts, notes, these words, page. To score, to scar, to smear, to streak, to smudge, to blur, to gouge, to scrape. Action painting, they call it. The painter gets to behave like time. The typo would be painting, action painting. To render time and stand outside the horizontal rush of it for a moment, to have the sensation of standing outside the green rush of it. Some vertical desire then, the way that anger or desire, some vertical gesture then, the way that anger or desire can rip a life apart, some wound of color. I have a dream journal that I keep quite randomly and intermittently, and then at a certain point I stopped using it for dreams and started using it for daydreams that seemed like dreams. So I don't know exactly what it is. Anyway, I have been mining it lately, and I did one, and then I thought this is sort of to talk about work and work habits. Then I saw that there was a pattern of weird domestic situations that look completely normal. And I'm imagining a sequence of very, very plain poems that are weird domestic situations that look completely normal or completely normal. Anyway, I'm still feeling my way through it. And when I sat down to start working on it and booted up my computer to type up some of the ones that I had, a title appeared out of nowhere. I must have left it there for some anyway, the title was What is Understanding? So the poem didn't have a title, so its title now, given to it by the Dell computer, is What is Understanding? A house of old, soft, salt-lustered wood, windows onto dune grass and a beach. His wife is upstairs working in her study when the doorbell rings. The young man at the door, a Jehovah's Witness, has an Adam's apple so protuberant it's conducting a flirtation with deformity. The man, trying not to stare, has a sudden panicked premonition that his wife needs help, and then a stronger feeling that he has no wife, has never had a wife, that something has gone wrong with his mind. The young man, eyes hard with unfocused greed, is talking about something he calls the first awakening. When the lights went out, she drove to town and bought a lot of candles. The whole village was in the general store buying flashlights, batteries, oil lamp mantles, fuel, telling the story of where they were when everything went dark, lingering a while in this sudden village, in the village. When she got home, the power was restored and the house was empty. That's how the radio described it, power restored. She woke him to say that everything was loud. The nightbird song, the white of the daisies in the garden in the dark. Then she woke him to describe headlights on the road across the bay. They seemed as lonely as the earth. He said at that hour it must have been a fisherman. He was probably baiting a line for sand sharks as they spoke. He fell asleep imagining the man setting his line, pouring coffee from a thermos, blowing on his hands, shuddering against the cold. She was still awake beside him, her panic like the wind. It was hot. She was stripping a kitchen chair she'd bought at a garage sale. She was working indoors because the sun outside would dry the paint remover as fast as she applied it. So she worked in the kitchen and opened the windows, hoping for a little breeze. There was none. There were 3 layers of paint on the chair, white, a wintergreen shade of green, and red. 3 generations of it. She watched her mind shy from forming a notion of endeavor. And underneath the paint, she saw what looked like cedar. Let's see, different kinds of things. Maybe one more poem, 2 more poems. This one is called, maybe I'll read, this one and then the other one. Then Time. In winter, in a small room, a man and a woman have been making love for hours. Exhausted, happy, they look at each other suddenly, laughing. "What is this?" he says. "I can't get enough of you," she says, a woman who thinks of herself as not given to cliché, and runs her fingers slowly across his chest, tentative touches as if she were testing her wonder. He says, "Me too." She says, beginning to be herself again, "You mean you can't get enough of you either?" "I mean," he takes her arms in his hands and shakes them, "where does this come from?" She cocks her head and looks into his face. "Do you really want to know?" "Yes," he says. "Self-hatred," she says. "Longing for God." Kisses him again. "It's not what it is." Wry shrug. "It's where it comes from." Kisses his bruised mouth a second time, a third. Years later, in another city, they're having dinner in a quiet restaurant near a park. Fall. Earlier that day, hard rain. Leaves, brass-colored and smoky crimson, flying everywhere. 20 years older, she is very beautiful, an astringent person. She'd become, she said, an obsessive gardener. Her daughter's grown. He's trying not to be overwhelmed by love or pity because he sees she has no hands. He thinks she must have given them away. He imagines very clearly how she wakes some mornings. He has a vivid memory of her younger self, stirred from sleep, flushed, eyes just opening. Wakes from sleep to momentary horror because she can't remember what she'd done with them, why they were gone. And then she remembers and calms herself, and the day takes on its customary sequence once again. She asks him if he thinks about her. Occasionally, he says, smiling. And you? Not much, she says. I think it's because we never existed inside time. He studies her long, cool fingers, a painter's hands or a gardener's as she fiddles with her wine glass, and understands vaguely that she does have hands, that it must be his own that are gone. When the salad arrives, he's describing a meeting he'd sat in all day as a committee man, chaired by someone they'd felt many years ago mutually superior to. You know the expression, a perfect fool, she'd said not long after they had met. He'd liked her tone of voice so much. Then she begins a story of the company in Maine she orders bulbs from, started by a Polish refugee who's married a Canadian separatist from Quebec. It's a story with many surprising turns and a rare chocolate black lily at the end. He's listening, studying her face, still turning over her remark. He thinks that she thought more symbolically than he did, and that it seemed to save her, for all her fatalism, from certain kinds of pain. She finds herself thinking what a literal man he is, notices, as if she were remembering it, his pleasure in the menu and the cooking and the architecture of the room. It moves her in that way that earnest limitation can be moving. She's moved by her attraction to him also, by what he was to her. She sees her own avidity to live then, or not to not have lived might be more accurate, from a distance, the way a driver might see from the road a startled deer running across an open field in the rain. Wild thing, here and gone. Death made it poignant, or if not death exactly, which he'd come to think of as creatures seething in a compost heap, then time. So one more of these poems. That's an almost iambic pentameter poem that I got going on and thought, well, we could talk about process later. I'll read one more poem. This is called Against the Wind. My first wife's older sister's third husband's daughter. That's about as long as a line of verse should get. Just sailed by me on the Berkeley street. A field guide's kinship map? Karmic debris? The little map in the back of a multi-generation novel? She's a student of complex mathematical systems, a pretty girl, ash-colored hair. I could have changed her diapers, and that small frown might be her parents' messy lives. Desire that hollowed us out and hollowed us out, that kills us and raises us up and raises us up. Always laughable from the outside. The English wit who complained of sex that the posture was ridiculous had not been struck down by the god or goddess to whose marble threshing floor offerings of grapes or olive boughs and flowers or branches laden with new fruit or bundles of heavy-headed wheat were brought as to any other mystery or power. My friend sat on the back steps on a summer night, sick with her dilemma, smoking long cigarettes, while bats veered in the dark and the scraping sound of a neighbor cleaning a grill with a wire brush ratcheted steadily across the backyard fence. I never imagined myself in this life. He's the nicest man I've ever met, she had said, and I feel like I'm dying. Probably in her middle 30s then, flea markets on Saturday mornings, family dinners on Sunday, a family large enough so that there always seemed to be a birthday, some maiden aunt from the old neighborhood in San Francisco, or a brother-in-law, or one of the children. Had not lived where, tearing, or like burnished leaves in a vortex of wind, the part of you that might observe the comedy of gasps and moans gives way does not demur, though she did laugh at herself. Though she did laugh at herself in erotic attachment one whole winter to the mouth of a particular television actor. She turned the TV on, watch him for a minute with kind of sick yearning, shake her head, turn the TV off, go back to the translation of Van Gogh's Letters, which was her project that year, or do some ironing. That always seemed to calm her, the sweet iron smell of steam and linen. Honest to God, she'd say. An expression the elderly aunts might have used. For Pete's sake, she'd say, get yourself together. Hollow flute or bell not struck, sending out a shimmering not sound in waves and waves to the place where the stunned dead in the not beginning are gathered to the arms of the living in the not noon. The living who grieve, who rage against and grieve the always solicited, always unattended dead in the tiered plazas or lush meadows of their gathered absence. A man wants a woman that way, a person, down on all fours, ravenous and humbled. And later, lovers, you remember the shoeshine boys in Quito, in the city market, missing teeth, unlaced tennis shoes? They approach you smiling. Their hands are scrofulous. They have no rules, and they'll steal anything. And so would you if you were they. The capital has always just been sacked. The temple hangings burned, and peasants in the ruins are roasting the royal swans in a small fire coaxed from sticks of the tax assessor's empire chair up against a broken wall. It's always Lent, the saints' bodies dressed in purple sacks to be taken off at Easter. For Magdalene, of course, the resurrection didn't mean she'd got him back. It meant she'd lost him in another way. It was the voice she loved, the body, not the God, who, she had been told, ascended to his heaven, there to disperse tenderness and pity on the earth. Thank you.
Got a quieter voice than you do.
Did it sound like audible or edible in the back? Let's get clear.
Can you hear us? Are we audible to everyone? Okay. Well, thanks, Bob. You ended with those were all recent poems, correct? In that last poem, I'm just curious, how did you go, at the beginning of the poem, you were in a Berkeley street, and by the end of the poem, you were talking about the Magdalene and Christ, and so how did the poem take you from you have no idea.
I got this thought, and then this thought, and then this thought. I mean, you kind of write out on a line sometimes, and then I actually, at the moment, don't remember. I'd have to look at my drafts to see if it went there right away, or it went there. I guess I'm still not quite sure. It seems to me, this work I've been doing recently, that kind of thing is happening a lot. That is, I'm at some level talking about the same thing, but the whole term of the way it's being talked about is changed. So the subject seems kind of to be changing wildly, but it really isn't.
Uh-huh.
Or at least that's how it seems to me.
So the central subject remains the same.
The
central idea of the poem.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to ask, it's interesting that poem began in Berkeley, because I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to be a California writer. You've written so much about this landscape and being a native of this place, someone who grew up here. I'm wondering, since California is in so many ways geologically and a younger place than, say, New York, where we think of the literary establishment as being, how are writers from California different than writers from other parts of America?
Well, it's an interesting question bunch of questions, because one, there are too many Californias to be an answer to that.
I'm thinking of
you
a
know.
generic California.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, I think that there are really two, maybe there have been three or four, but San Francisco and Los Angeles have developed very different literary traditions. And then a change in the world is that universities over the last 25 years have become literary centers. So, for example, there was a period when Philip Levine was teaching at California State at Fresno, that a lot of young poets came out of the Fresno Creative
Right.
Writing Program. To some extent, they were kids who had grown up in the Central Valley and whose concerns, way of seeing the world belonged to that region, though to some extent not, because people go to school from anywhere. No other center like that occurs to me, though maybe there is one in San Diego now. Also at San Diego State, where I know two very interesting poets and a very good short story writer teach. So I think that for young people now, it means wherever you go, you're apt to find other writers, other people practicing whatever art you're practicing, and a community in which you can find a way to it.
Well,
But-
sorry, go ahead.
Well, you go ahead.
What about Berkeley then, as a place for writers? What about this school to you is a good place to be a writer?
Well, they say about Berkeley, it's the place in the country where you can't throw a rock and not hit either a poet or a psychoanalyst.
philosopher.
Yeah.
Oh. I heard philosopher.
A
but-
physicist, did you hear? Yeah. There's certainly been a lot of poets here, and it's because of the university, though it's one of the first famous poets who came here to study was Robert Penn Warren. Came in 1922 as a graduate student to get his PhD, and he wrote a letter back to his friends at home and said, they're real smart out here and they really know a lot about Freud and Marx, but they haven't read The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, the new poem that just came out. Have you seen it? So Berkeley, in a way, always had that reputation of being not the place where the most current art was being done, but the place where the intellectual cutting edge was happening.
Right.
And that sort of changed slowly over time. Changed partly in the 1950s when there was a collection of wonderful poets here. There were other writers. I mean, I don't know if the university does a very good job of letting the students know how many writers have passed through here and who they are. There's a lot of work has come out of this university. But in poetry, at least, this period of pressure was the 50s, when the so-called poets of the San Francisco Renaissance, Robert Duncan and Jack Spicer and Robin Blazer were undergraduates here together. They were living in a house over on Euclid, off of La Loma, I think, with the guy who later wrote the Campfire song. What's that song? That song goes, hello, Mata. Hello, Fada. Here I am. And
Camp Granada.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The four of them were living in a house over here in the Berkeley Hills.
It's interesting.
You probably, well, we're on that subject. You probably didn't know that the guy who wrote The Purple Cow was a Berkeley professor. You know that poem? Maybe you don't anymore. It used to be the most famous poem on earth. I never saw a purple cow. I never hoped to see one, but I can tell you anyhow I'd rather see than be one. Was written by a man named Gillette Burgess, who was an instructor in drafting in the architecture department in 1898, and he published it in a magazine called The Argonaut in San Francisco, and it made his reputation and made him miserable. Later, he wrote a poem that goes, "Oh yes, I wrote The Purple Cow. I'm sorry now I wrote it, but I can tell you anyhow, I'll kill you if you quote it." Of the great popular pulp novelists of the 1930s, the two famous writers of Westerns were Zane Grey and Max Brand. I don't think anybody reads those books anymore, but Max Brand, who wrote over 100 best-selling pulp Westerns in the 30s and 40s, was a kid named Fred Fierstein, who was a graduate in English at Berkeley, who took that as his pen name. Joan Didion, of course, passed through here. Irving Stone, popular novelist and biographer. Jack London grew up very poor in Oakland, and there's a very touching story in his autobiography, John Barleycorn, about coming to stand on the steps of Wheeler Hall. At that point, about 3% of American young went to the university. It was something that a small elite did in this country. And this kid, who had been fed books by a poet named Ina Coolbrith, who was a librarian at the Oakland Library, was so hungry for books and for education, he signed up for the university and he got in. He made his living on the street in Oakland selling newspapers and buying candy with the pennies that he made from it, and his teeth had about rotted out by the time he was 18. And standing on the steps of Wheeler Hall, looking at what looked to him like all these golden kids in fawn-colored cords and sleeveless argyle sweaters, he said he felt so self-conscious about his rotting teeth that he walked away and never came back. Started writing novels and stories instead, and then went to Alaska to the gold rush, where he found his subject matter. Anyway, there are lots of stories about Berkeley, California, its literary history.
Right. It's always been a place of creative ferment. It's a nice intersection. But speaking about the Jack London story and how we become interested in reading as children, I was wondering, you have a wonderful essay in 20th Century Pleasures where you mentioned reading Wallace Stevens as you were 8th grade, 9th grade. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you became a reader of poetry, reading poetry, and what that meant to you as a child, if you remember.
Well, I think that neither of my parents went to college, both of the Depression generation, but their parents had.
Oh, interesting.
And it was a sort of unusual pattern in that way. And so I had one grandmother who was always, there was an older generation that could still recite a lot of verse, left over from the years when a lot of public school teaching had to do with memorization and recitation and some ideal of eloquence. So the tag, I'm sure that was gone when you guys were in school, because it was mostly gone when I was in school. So in my family, in any middle class or blue-collar family with books, up until maybe the 1920s or so, poetry was in the air. Some way it seems like radio wiped it out. And so that was one thing. Another was that I had an older brother who liked to read poetry out loud, who was more interested in it than I was. He also, when I read Tom Sawyer, I thought, that's my brother. I just recognized him like that. My brother had the idea, we got a dictionary for Christmas once. middle-class gift to children, and a huge dictionary. He put it on a table in our room and said, I know what we should do. That meant, what we should do meant, I enjoy giving orders to my younger brother. I know what we should do. We should, when we read, we look up every word we don't know and we'll write it in a book here. And he got a notebook. And we'll memorize all the words and use them in our compositions. And I don't remember for how long we did that, but I do remember that we did it for a while, and that once I got called up by my 5th or 6th grade teacher because I'd written a sentence in a composition for class in which I had said that I suddenly realized there was an exigent need for retrospection. So I liked words, but it was also, I was sort of gouged in that direction by my overbearing older brother's interest. And I guess I memorized some poetry in school, and my brother and I wrote little comic light verse poems, wrote them out in pencil. The magazine that came to our house from my parents by subscription was called the Saturday Evening Post, and it had a humor page. And we would try to write funny poems and send it to submit. This is again my brother's initiative. Send it to the humor. We never heard back from them. I don't know why. I mean, we were only not more than 10, I'm sure. The story that in this essay was about winning a second prize in a contest, a book contest, when I was in the 8th grade, and which was a gift certificate to a bookstore. And I went into the bookstore. I'd been to the public library a lot, but I think it was the first time I'd ever been in a bookstore. And I had this important document worth 10, and I had no idea what to get. I didn't want to get a kid's book, not more Hardy Boys books or any of the series. So I didn't know what to get with my first adult book purchase. And there was a everyman library book, modern library book called A Comprehensive Anthology of American Poetry. Maybe I was impressed by the word comprehensive, but that was what I picked out and took home. And I started to read it, and to my disappointment, everything in it was completely unintelligible to me. I couldn't understand it at all. And so I set it aside, and I think it was a year or two later that I picked it up, and I came across a poem by Wallace Stevens, though I didn't know it was by Wallace Stevens, an early poem of his written when he was in his 30s, living in a rooming house in New York. I know everything about the circumstances of its composition. Now, in 1917, a young German-American from Pennsylvania who had been to Harvard and studied at the time high tide of aesthete poetry and read the French poets and was trying to write symboliste poems like a French poet with a kind of haunted rhythmical sound. And this poem, I can't recite it. Oh, wait a minute. I think I may have it here, actually, because I brought that book of essays, and it may actually quote the poem in it. I'm going on and on. Is this remotely interesting? It's so narcissistic. Can't believe it. And then I had the excitement of, at night, by the fire, let's say I'm 12, 13, just in puberty. This man was 33, 34, lonesome, probably still a virgin, a bachelor in New York. At night, by the fire, the colors of the bushes and of the fallen leaves repeating themselves, turned in the room like the leaves themselves turning in the wind. Yes, but the color of the heavy hemlocks came striding, and I remember the cry of the peacocks. The color of their tails was like the leaves themselves turning in the wind, in the twilight wind. They swept over the room just as they flew from the boughs of the hemlocks down to the ground. I heard them cry, the peacocks. Was it a cry against the twilight or against the leaves themselves, turning in the wind, turning as the flames turned in the fire, turning as the tails of the peacocks turned in the loud fire, loud as the hemlocks, full of the cry of the peacocks, or was it cry against the hemlocks? Out of the window, I saw how the planets gathered like the leaves themselves turning in the wind. I saw how the night came striding like the colors of the heavy hemlocks. I felt afraid, and I remembered the cry of the peacocks. I didn't have the faintest idea what this poem meant, but it raised the hair on the back of my neck, and it was a feeling certainly connected to fear. It was an aesthetic sensation, right? It's that thing like, why do you watch a horror movie or a thing like this? But it's a bit Poe-esque too, it occurs to me now as I read it, a little bit like that. But there was something about it, and it was years before I could say to myself what it was to me, and a sort of rough way of saying it was that it felt true. That it was connected for me. I grew up in a family with alcohol problems. And if you know anything about living in families with addiction, the main thing is nobody ever tells the truth about anything after a while. Subjects are too difficult and embarrassing, and everybody's kind of trying to get on with life, and after, disaster recovery. And in that pattern, it's emotionally bewildering for a little kid. Is everything okay? Yeah, everything is okay. It's very hard to have a truth in that situation. And I still, I think it's quite common. I think 3/4 of us are looking at everybody else to find out what's normal behavior to behave in order to behave normally in every circumstance, the social contract really is the blind leading the blind. Everybody thinks they came from the weird family and that everybody else came from the normal family and therefore knows how to do normal things, but you're the one who doesn't know. Then there are the exceptions, who are, that's called the leadership class, maybe, or something like that. But it was the first time in my life I had felt the emotional truthfulness of a thing, something like that. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a later dramatization of what actually happened, because I was writing an essay and I tuned the thing up slightly in the telling. But that was my experience, and it's still for me the most powerful thing about poetry, I think.
Mm-hmm. Did some of the poems in your first book, Field Guide, were written as an undergraduate, right? I think, wasn't Book Buying in the Tenderloin, did you write that?
Yeah, one.
So did you become a writer in college, or was it later for you?
In college, first of all, there really wasn't creative writing classes then. It was just at the end of there not being creative writing classes. So I wrote stories, I wrote poems. It was the years of the civil rights movement, and one of the most powerful writers of that period, the early 1960s, was James Baldwin. And his essays, Notes of a Native Son and Nobody Knows My Name, probably made a bigger impact on me as contemporary writing than any other writing. They were just amazing. They are still just amazing essays. And he mentioned his admiration for the essays of Camus. So I went to the Camus essays in translation, of course, and read essays, political and lyrical, I think the volume was called, and fell in love with Camus' essays. So it seemed to me there were sort of these 4 viable art forms. A couple of friends I knew were writing plays. You could write plays, you could be a philosophical essayist, you could be a poet, you could be a fiction writer, and I was sort of trying all of them and showing, in the way that you do, showing stuff to your group of friends. I can still recite the poems of my friends from those years, undergraduate, or lines at least, fragments from those poems, that experience of that you guys, some of you must be having now, of showing each other your work is so vivid and intense. But I had no idea how you go about being a writer, or if I ever would, if there was any way. I had no clue how to get there from here.
So how did it happen for you, if you don't mind my asking?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's ridiculous to say I'm not sure it ever did, but the specific way that it happened. So I was writing in college, and my friends, I had friends who were self-described poets, and I would show them, especially the older ones than me who were on the Laureate magazine. I showed them my poems, which were truly wretched, and they said, stick to fiction. So I was mainly trying to write stories as an undergraduate. And then I dropped out of school for a year and tried to write a novel. And then, which I accumulated many pages of Faulknerian, Conradian descriptions of, kind of, I remember the beginning of it is this young, drunken person, amazingly like myself, having like a 15-page Proustian reverie about the meaning of doorknobs that made me realize after a while that I was really not cut out for narrative storytelling, which is how, so anyway, when I was in graduate school, I went on to graduate school in English, and mainly because I didn't know what else to do, and saw with huge clarity that college professors got 3 months off every year. That seemed like a really good kind of job to have. And I admired my professors. I thought they were really interesting people, had interesting lives, got to read books and think about things. So, and so I went to Stanford because they let me in, and in the library there, I started finding literary magazines. Also, I started to become aware of the Beat generation in San Francisco. I started reading Jack Kerouac and Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg, and then I found the magazines where that whole generation of poets was publishing. Besides Ginsberg, Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery and Adrienne Rich and Denise Levertov and others. And I was reading the novelists of the period that people were enthusiastic about, Bernard Malamud and John Updike and John Cheever and Philip Roth. And though I thought they were interesting, I didn't fall in love with them. Didn't think it was amazing, but the poetry seemed to me really amazing. And a range of things people doing. So I just found myself reading a lot of poetry, reading intensely. And then lines of poems would start to come into my head, and I started filling notebooks with them. And it was just what I wanted to do. I mean, I couldn't wait to get home to open my notebook. And I never said to myself, now I'm going to try to write, or now I'm shifting to, I was just possessed by this and fascinated and reading, knocked out by some of the poetry I was reading. It felt like it could do so much. There was such a range of expressive possibilities in it, and to do something in that art, to make a real poem, that seemed enormously exciting to me. And to finish this quick, I took a lecture course from a famous old reactionary curmudgeonly poet at Stanford named Ivor Winters, whose most famous poem goes, "The young are glib and quick of speech." grown middle-aged, I teach corrosion and mistrust, exacting what I must. So anyway, that was, he was a confirmed old classicist with the manner of, he'd been a prize fighter and he came at you that way. And he talked about, he taught a creative writing class, and I found him terrifying, and I didn't like his ideas about poetry, but I'd never heard anybody talk about anything as passionately as I heard him talk about poetry. And that was enormously inspiring to me.
Mm-hmm. Do you still, you were talking about feeling, for me, when I get an idea for something I want to write, I sort of feel as if I'm going to vomit, this anxiety. I have to get it written. And do you still have that feeling now that you had when you were younger, that anxiety, that it's got to come out onto the page?
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes I do. Mm-hmm. I have to say, in the last few years, I was thinking about doing this and about talking about the work of a writer, and I think my working habits have gotten so wretched in the last few years.
You've had a very busy life.
Yeah, I've had a very busy life. That I thought, well, this is a good example of not good writing habits. Here I am in the middle of the day when I could be talking about having writing habits rather than being home writing. If I had writing habits, I'd be home writing. I wouldn't be sitting here talking about why I don't have writing habits anymore.
Speaking of habits, you mentioned a dream journal or a daydream journal. Have you always started your poems in a journal or gotten ideas in a journal?
My experience of writing is that I almost can't begin with the blank page. That just as a practical matter, I have a huge pile of compost, notebooks, journals, discarded drafts of things written I don't know when. You write something down on a piece of paper. I have tons of that kind of paper. And if I'm not in the middle of working on a poem, and I'm getting started, I rarely sit down and say, I have this poem that a friend, these are the afflictions of having been a poet laureate. Somebody asked me, there was a conference at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. The Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory is the place where all of the primary research on global warming was done in the 60s and 70s. It's a great institution. And they're having their 50th anniversary, and a friend of mine is public relations person for them. And they were having a big conference. Gorbachev was going to be there, and Kofi Annan, and all the scientists who've had input on the global warming thing, and they wanted a poem on the state of the planet to initiate this great thing. And I don't know why I said yes. When she asked me, it was partly because I was teaching this class that Joe and I are teaching now. I thought, well, I'm doing this course on the science and literature of the environment. It would be interesting to see what I could do with that. But it involves sitting down with a blank piece of paper and writing on top of it the state of the planet. you just put your head down on the desk for half an hour after that. There's nothing else to do. Mostly, I'll find in a journal a line like, her panic like the wind, the line, whether it's a good in that poem, and then I think, what was that all about? And then I sit down and because I have this thing I'm working on, domestic situations, little things like um, so I write, she couldn't sleep. And then that seemed like, and then I forget how that poem, that little part of the poem begins now, but I think it begins, she woke him to say that everything was loud. And then I have that, and so on. But I couldn't have begun with the blank piece of paper. I need to have already written something down or heard a phrase, and then I could get going. I guess as practical advice to writers, I don't know what your experience with this is, Kai, over the last year.
I don't keep a journal.
Don't throw anything away.
Yeah.
Don't keep everything near at hand. Because somewhere in the compost of wretched and humiliating attempts at writing, there'll be one phrase that's alive for you.
And then you can always remember that no one else has to read it, drafts. I think that's what intimidates my students and me so much about journals and the idea of letting your writing be imperfect in its early stages, is this fear that someone will find it and expose you as a fraud or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about your composition process, just in terms of how do you write by hand in the drafting process?
Yeah, I write by hand. Then it used to be, and then I get on the computer at some point, and and I've had different feelings about it at different times. Sometimes I loved my handwriting and the intimacy of the journal, and sometimes I hated my handwriting and myself. And when it was typed, it wasn't me anymore. It looked semi-published, and it looked better, more plausible to me than it did in my own handwriting. And after a while, learning your own process, you just learn that you kind of have to put up with yourself, and that you are the stubborn mule or the horse or the creature that you've got to get to market on, and you've got to figure out what bribes to give the beast in order to get him going and get her going. And so sometimes I do whatever seems to work, and I notice that it changes sometimes, but I couldn't imagine sitting down and composing on a typewriter or a computer. Right. And I actually preferred typewriters to computers because of not being able to correct things. So that you had, with poems, it would be, you have to type over and over and over again, take it out, run it through the typewriter. I think I still know most of the poems in my first two books by heart because I typed them over so many times, just running them through the typewriter over and over again, because of one little mistake, which is in one way a good thing. My editor says that at HarperCollins, the editors were talking, and they agreed that manuscripts are typically, in the last 10 years, a third longer than they used to be. That biographies, for example, that used to come in at 500 pages now all come in at 800 pages. That's because of the great ease of revision and moving material around. When I was finished with my dissertation, I'd gotten a book of poems published, and I thought, great, I don't have to get a PhD, because I couldn't bear the idea of typing the whole thing again. And it wasn't until actually I was at a job and I got told that I was going to be fired because I didn't have a PhD, that I said I could get one. and then I paid to have my dissertation typed and filed it. But really, writing was a much more laborious process before the electronic prose-producing machines.
This is probably the $64 million question, but how do you know when a poem is finished? How do you know when to let it go?
You never do. I mean, sometimes it's, you write and it's done. Other times, you work for a while and you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then other times you just don't know. And you can fiddle with it forever.
Right. The Robert Duncan story, I think I heard this from your wife, that it took him 30 years to write one poem. My mother would be a falconess.
No, it was Robert, who was a great talker. Robert Duncan worked in this library, worked in the Morrison Room at one time. Of that generation, of the John Ashbery generation, he's a little bit older than those guys, but of that generation of poets, he was the most brilliant. He's bookish and he's difficult, and he's not widely read, I don't think, but he's an amazing poet, and he was a maybe more amazing talker, and you couldn't get a word in with him. He was a great monologue, and there's a famous story about. Speaking, I'm imitating him here by going on and on. Robert went to New York to see the poet Louis Zukofsky, the old objectivist poet of the 30s, experimental poet of the 30s, whom he adored, and he was terrified that he was going to talk the whole time to impress Zukofsky with his brilliance, and walk away not having heard a word of Zukofsky or experienced him. So he made himself stay up all night saying to himself in the mirror everything that he might want to say to talk himself out, so that when he went in, he could shut up and listen to Zukofsky. And if you said to Robert, "How are you?" he would, Charles Olson really thinks that it's okay if you have myths of Aztecs in your poems. If you mention Christianity, you can have African myths, Aztec myths, Incan myths, Hindu myths, but you can't mention Christianity in a poem. I don't get it. I mean, Western civilization isn't all that great, but it did invent two things. What things, Robert? Civil disobedience and romantic love. And so I think that, anyway, he was full of formulations like that. And so one day, someone said that he had said that he never revised a poem, and I simply couldn't believe it. So the next time I was walking with him, I said, "Is it true that you said to Michael Palmer that you never revise a poem?" And he said, I don't believe in revision. And there's this body of work, intricate and beautiful, and I was just floored. And I said, and there's one poem called "My Mother Would Be a Falconess" that's a kind of psychological parallel about him as the falcon on his mother's wrist, going out and coming back. And I said, and it's a beautiful poem, and I said, "So you didn't ever revise a word of 'My Mother Would Be a Falconess'?" He said, "Not a word." We walked along a little further, and I said, "How long did it take you to write it?" And he said, "About 36 months. It's one page long." He didn't acknowledge that there was such a thing as revision.
Right.
He just kept working at it until the poem was done. For you young people who are interested in writing, I'll tell you another similar story. When I was in Berkeley in the 50s, late 50s, there was a magazine here called Film Quarterly. Back in the early days of intelligent writing about movies, the first magazine of its kind that wasn't a fan magazine, but a kind of avant-garde journal of writing about movies, was the time when the great critic Pauline Kael was running a little movie theater on Telegraph Avenue. There was I've stopped doing this anecdotal thing. I was about to tell you about the taco stand next door and how you could take tacos in and watch silent Russian movies with juice pouring down. And Dwight MacDonald, who was a very important essayist and political writer of the 40s and 50s, an anti-Stalinist democratic socialist writer who took very smart, principled political stands, wrote a letter, enraged letter, quitting as a member of the board of Film Quarterly. And it was a stunning piece of writing. I remember reading the letter, reading it over again and thinking, boy, would I like to be able to write like that someday. 10 years later, I was at an award ceremony in New York on a sunny day in the spring, and William Burroughs, I was seeing all of these famous writers. It was quite thrilling and amazing to be there. And somebody introduced me to Dwight MacDonald, and I said, you know, you're not going to remember this, but because you wrote a letter years ago to Film Quarterly magazine, quitting the board, and before I could say, blah, 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 he said, not remember, I wrote that goddamn letter 25 times. When I read it, I thought, someday I'm going to be able to do that in one draft. Right? But I thought amazing writing got produced by people who just sat down and produced amazing writing. So Robert Duncan took 3 years writing or he's claimed to have taken 3 years, which meant I assumed that every once in a while he got it out and hummed it over to himself until its rhythms came right. So.
It reminds me of the story that Allen Ginsberg claimed to have never revised Howl, and then he published the annotated manuscript, and you can see scribbles all over it. All over it.
And so really smart revisions.
Exactly, his revisions are brilliant. So he was not telling the truth on that one. I guess the last thing I want to ask you before we take questions from the audience is about titling or naming. A lot of your writing is about the naming of experiences, and the book Field Guide, and naming objects, and this idea of naming domestic experiences and so on and so forth. How do you name a poem? Does the name come before the poem, during, after? Is it different every time?
It's different at different times. There are fashions in naming, and different people like different things about naming. Sometimes you want names to be as neutral as possible, because you feel like the poem it's like you've piled the thing up like there, you know. It didn't tilt too much this way, it didn't tilt too much this way, and you'd be afraid that a title would tilt it one way or the other, and so you don't want to title it at all, but maybe you don't want to not title it because of the severity of the not titling thing as a manner, and so you don't want to give it a title, but practically no title. And then there are the poets who, Wallace Stevens' titles are, his table of contents is practically a poem because the titles are so much fun. So you can do a title that really wants to do what titles do, give the reader a little help to get into the piece of writing that's coming, or you can do it to divert them, or you can do it to suggest another dimension of the poem, or to create a kind of atmosphere for not just the poem, but maybe for a book of poems. For a while, my wife was only writing poems with 2-word titles, and she would have torment because she'd thought of a title that she really liked that was 3 words and she couldn't use it. And with my larcenous heart, I thought it was no problem at all. You just 3 words, but she was really, and also I started going through life thinking every time I'd see a 2-word phrase that I thought was a Brenda Hillman poem, you know, I'd go back and say, sad cookies, anyway. You get 2 words together that something happens in. So different things, different times. One, in my second book of poems, Praise, I wrote in first draft rapidly, but then very slowly, a bunch of poems that were not titled. And I wanted to title them for that reason, that I didn't want them, because somehow it looked to me mannered to have it not titled. It's a matter of conventions. And I didn't know how to do it. And there used to be a thing in the Middle Ages that my high school Latin teacher had told me about, called the sortes Virgilianae, in which you told fortunes because they had the idea that one of Virgil's Georgics had predicted the birth of Christ, got read as that, and it's one of the things that made him a special legendary figure in medieval lore and why he became Dante's guide in the Inferno. And there was a thing of telling your fortune by stabbing a page in Virgil and reading the phrase and interpreting it. It would tell you, your fortune, like a fortune cookie would. So many of these poems that I was writing, which were sort of on erotic themes, felt to me like they came out of, partly out of stuff I had read about Neoplatonism and romantic love in the early Renaissance. And so I went and found a book on that subject, an absolutely wonderful book called Pagan Mysteries of the Renaissance by Edgar Vint, which was mainly about all the different mystical interpretations of the figures of the three graces. The Botticelli painting where the three graces. So it had long allegorical readings of all of Botticelli's paintings. And so I would take one of my poems and I'd go like that in the book, and it would say, transparent garments, which was a description of the thing that the graces were wearing. And so that would become the title of a poem. And I'd go like that. And it was a quote of a line from a description of the three graces in The Fairy Queen, like three fair branches from one root derived. So I called this poem that's really just about walking around San Francisco, like three fair branches from one root derived. And it was just fun to have this gorgeous stuff. Mm-hmm. And of course if it didn't work, I didn't do it, but you kind of kept going. And you could cheat that way, if it went down. Other scholars assert, you'd say, no, that wasn't right.
Well, on that note, we're rapidly losing people, so perhaps it's time to take a few questions. We have, I think my watch is fast, 10 minutes? Okay, so we could take a couple questions.
Sure.
Huh?
Yes.
You spoke about feeling that you recognize the truth in that Wallace Stevens.
In reading the Wallace Stevens poem, there was a seeking of a sense of truth and whether or not Bob is trying to find that same sort of resonance in his own poems.
In deciding that it's finished.
In deciding that the poem is finished, looking for that same resonance.
Sometimes one is working on that. I am usually in some way working on that. When you're making poems, you're on the one hand expressing something, but on the other hand you're making something. You're making a kind of thing. And if you're making poems, certain things might start to be problematical to you about ways of writing poems. Like you're bored with poems that have a strong emotional arc and a killer ending. So you don't want to do that. So you write a poem and it sort of feels like it's got an interesting material for you. I felt like and it might be that you're trying to get at the truth of that material. I mean, for an example of uneasiness for me, something that I would go back and worry about is, in a certain way, that poem I read, Against the Wind, about what happened for me was that that line, my first wife's second older sister's third husband's daughter, I thought, God, what a mess our self-indulgent generation made. I think of all these children in Berkeley saying, Heather's mom's girlfriend is picking up David, and then her dad is picking up, and his, you know, so these kids have gotten used to these extended families and get shuttled back and forth in shared custody arrangements. And marriage is hard, but anyway, but we act it out a lot. So this poem turns into a kind of meditation, in a way, a defense of that desire that hollows us out and hollows us out, and then that meditation on the woman saying, you know, saying in effect, he's the nicest man I can, but I feel trapped, and thinking about the way people tear their lives apart out of romantic unhappiness and romantic longing, in a way defending it, in a way not defending it. And then I think, so I finish it, and then I think, it's okay if people are self-indulgent in their sexual lives, but you're in a fury about people driving SUVs. You know, what kind of indulgences are okay? I mean, why not a poem praising sanity, civility, and moderation? You know, so I mean, there's that. I mean, it's in the nature of poetry, and to some extent, that it's dialectical. And one of the things that I've learned about from Miloš is that he's progressed in his career by writing poems against himself. He writes one thing, he writes against that. He looks at it from this point of view, looks at it from that point of view, is willing to let the contradictions in his poems get torqued to almost intolerable dimension. So sometimes it could be getting at the truth of a thing in that sense, that the emotion of the poem feels, you know, well, I don't know, after you've written it. Not that you haven't expressed a certain way of looking at a thing with as much complexity and force as you think you can muster, but that then there's always another way of looking at it, and shouldn't that be? And then when do you kill a piece of writing with second thoughts? And then beyond that, there's this question of what I'm interested in, the way one thing turns into another thing, turns into another thing, turns into another thing. And then there's the question of endings. I don't like endings. You know, I don't like the trajectory of insight is kind of as a movement in a poem, bothersome sometimes. Like Forster said, a novel, alas, has a plot. A poet might say it. A poem, alas, you know, has this tidal pull toward form that you'd like to slip the noose of sometimes.
I think we can do one in the back. She asked if he could talk about meditation at Lagunitas. There's an excerpt from that poem in the program for today. Probably your most famous poem.
It's the poem of mine that I think that certainly is most anthologized and written about and translated. It's sort of an odd thing that you know, that in one's writing that happens. That you don't know. I didn't. When I wrote that piece, I thought. One of the things I was interested in was a technical, prosodical thing, which is how far you could go from the old form of the blank verse meditative poem, like Coleridge's Frost at Midnight or Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, which are written in blank verse, which is the measure of Shakespeare's plays, how far you could go from that and get the same kind of effect that those poems have, of a sort of musing wholeness of thinking in them. So I was interested in that, and I was interested in, I actually set that poem aside for a long time because it seemed clunky. It just seemed like this is particularly a time when there was a certain anti-intellectual quality in the poetics of that period, late 1960s, early 1970s. Everyone was writing books of poems with titles like Digging in the Roots and Gathering the Tribe, and people, showed up. Lee is smiling, we were there at the same time. Everybody kind of dressed to their archetypes, At a typical poetry reading in here, everybody would be dressed like, have been dressed like gypsies, bandits, cowboys, buffalo hunters, Indian princesses, so on. And the poetry was a lot about transformative myths. And one of the poets who was not like that at that time was Robert Duncan, who was therefore enormously appealing to me. So this kind of poem in which you're musing about philosophical issues I didn't know how to do and was awkward to do. So I remember putting it aside for a long time and then coming back and fooling with it. And I also remember the person who became my publisher, Daniel Halpern, was editing a journal in New York called Antaeus, and he asked me to send a bunch of poems, and I sent a bunch of poems, and he called me a few days later and said, I read your poems, and I read that poem. I don't know if it had a title then, or maybe it did, Meditation at Lagunitas, and he said, I was out walking. I just went out, I read it, I just went out walking. Summer night in New York, and came back and read it again. It's really, I don't know what it is about it, but it's something really, you did something there. So that was, somebody said, oh, there's a poem. And it wasn't the poem I wanted praise for at the time. And then later you find, oh my God, you've written, there's some fear of becoming famous for one poem. I've heard the last line of that poem is a litany repetition of the word blackberry, 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 blackberry. And I'm afraid I've heard it translated into many languages, including Serbian, where I think the word is spurt. for that particular berry, So.
I think we might have time for just one more question. So. Oh, sorry. Over. He was asking about Neoplatonism and whether let me see if I can get your question right. The Platonist, the ideal can be translated into any art form. Is that basically the gist of what you're asking? Okay.
Boy, what an interesting question.
It's a good place to end.
This is not a bad place to end with. There's in contemporary poetics right now. There's been a kind of powerful feeling that the poetry that has subject matter and tries to get somewhere with the subject matter is sort of used up. That the ways of doing that are used up, and that most of the ways of using representation are exhausted in poetry, partly because they've been debauched by mimesis as such. The effort to imitate the, quote, real has been debauched so much by advertising and by the walls of representation by which we're constantly surrounded, that poetry that still makes the romantic gesture of a unified voice of a particular person trying to render, describe, and make sense of the world in one song-like or rhythmically organized gesture can't be done. You know, I mean, a crude way of saying it would be that if you look at the ads in the New Yorker, they've taken over the idiom of immediacy in poetry. You know, it is her birthday, which is why you are pouring Drambuie slowly over ice, is not that different from what goes on in the poems on the other page. So there's, plus the feeling, set of postmodern suspicions that are the ground of work in the university now. If anybody arrives at a formulation, that's ideology, distrust it. If you claim to have an authentic self, look again. You know, read Lacan. There's no such thing. The authentic self is also a bourgeois ideological construction. Do you think you can know there's a real world? Guess again. Knowledge is also a construction. The university is a construction. And what we need to do is deconstruct it. So those are all sound suspicions. Good, you know, good intellectual tools. It's part of the university's function is to be critical, to develop critical traditions and to scour the received tradition before passing it on. To wander into such a state of affairs and say, what is the function of Plato's idea of the good, is really an interesting question. And I guess, and yet it seems to me that a sort of short answer to this would be, I don't think there's a way philosophically to get from is to ought. I don't think that reason can get you to ethics. Reason can reason about what's there, but you can't reason to the place where you say what ought to be done, except in the most practical way. You know, chances are it's better if you don't walk into fast traffic. Is a kind of thing that practical reason can do. The good of life that lies behind that doesn't need to be argued for. But then when you come to the bombing of Iraq, it's not so self-evident what the good is. 7 million people in that city. Maybe 100,000 of them doing well off the regime, the rest of them captives of some international war that's going to get lots of them killed, men, women, and children. And you try to apply the idea of the good to it. That's an interesting question. It does seem to me that it's what the arts do. That part of their constructive work is not to get that right, because poets in the 20th century have either been Stalinists or fascists mostly. They had dreadful politics. They got it wrong most of the time. But you don't love Ezra Pound because of those politics. You love him because he said it coheres, because he made images and stuff that reminded you that there was, that he made images of justice. He made images of beauty. He made images of anger at injustice. He made images of a desire for order and clarity, and for a public life that had civility and order and clarity. He had made images of freedom and so on, and so do other poets, that are how we still know and taste those things. You know? Osip Mandelstam was not particularly wise about politics, and he got himself killed for making fun of Stalin. And during the period when he was trying to recover from that, he actually tried to write a poem to praise Stalin so that not to get killed. He went through terrible things. But in one of his poems, he said, because in the old city-states of medieval Russia, the questions of social justice came down to who owned the water that got into the cities. So that a public fountain in the center of the city where any citizen could go and get water and didn't have to pay a tax on it was the representation of a fair place. So Mandelstam said in a poem, justice is the well water of the city of Novgorod. So that's how you know what the good is. But by doing whatever that thing in poetry is, you know.
Isn't it kind of scary to be trusting a fascist idea of justice?
Images of justice, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the 20th century thinker who has the most interesting things to say about poetry is Heidegger. I said to Miłosz once, isn't it problematic that that Heidegger, who says all the wise things about poetry, is a fascist? And he said, well, I'm not sure they're wise, they're just flattering to us. Anyway, this is a long and interesting conversation. But I think the arts are still the place where you go for that, where you go to experience it. So thank you all very much for
Thank you, Rob.
coming.